Rose. How you doing? Yeah, it's great. Okay, we're ready to go. Welcome. This is the UT Energy Symposium, March 29th, 2022. Our distinguished speaker today is Caitlin Smith from Jupiter Power. We'll introduce her in a second. Her talk will be location, 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 deploying batteries in the right time and place for a transitioning grid. So we're looking forward to that. So just a quick note before I introduce Caitlin, give you a preview of some upcoming UT Energy Symposium talks. Next week, April 5th, we'll have Beyond the Plug, how VW Group is looking at the future of energy systems with Dr. Will Paxton, Senior Scientist and Project Lead of the Innovation Center in California, the Volkswagen Group of America. And then on April 12th, we'll have a panel discussion on what investors are asking of oil and gas companies and transportation vehicle companies. So with that, let's introduce Caitlin. So battery storage is poised to be a game changer in ERCOT and the grid. Some of you have been learning about this in our class, Energy Technology and Policy, and following it. There's nothing like automotive to drive up volumes, drive down cost, improve reliability, and that'll spill over to the grid. So let me give some background on Caitlin. She is the Senior Director of Regulatory External Affairs and ESG with Jupiter Power, a leading energy storage developer and operator. She has in-depth experience with the ERCOT market and was the first in-house counsel for the independent market monitor, that's Potomac Economics, to ERCOT, and currently sits on ERCOT's Technical Advisory Committee. Her work focuses on aligning market incentives, resiliency, and the energy transition. For the last 9 years, she has focused on electricity market design and has worked both as an advocate for policies that have enhanced our electricity markets and as an advisor to the commercial and financial impacts of energy policy. Her broad experience in government and regulatory affairs, as well as in public affairs, have led Caitlin to become a well-versed speaker and author across topics ranging from clean energy to wholesale energy market design. She recently founded Jupiter Power's Women Professional Development Organization, or Women's Professional Development Initiative. And she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from UT Austin, a Juris Doctorate from Penn State, and also a Master of Laws in Environmental and Natural Resource Law and Policy from the University of Denver. And with that, I'd like to welcome her here, and thank you so much for coming.
Great, I think I'm going to use this mic. Well, thanks for having me. I'll get some logistics out of the way. We do have a fair amount of people in the auditorium, so I think we have mics. So I like to take questions during the topic, so if you have any questions, I think we can get a mic to you, and I will repeat the question for the audience at home or at work, and we can make it a little bit interactive. David introduced what we are going to cover today. As he said, I think we hear a lot about batteries kind of being a game changer. I think it's a buzzword. I think some of these talks here have been done really on the technology. You know, somebody will come here and tell you about technology advances, things in the supply chain, how to make the technology last longer. But my background is Texas, so I'm going to use Texas as the example to talk about how batteries work on our wholesale grid. So not the batteries at home, but the ones that give power to the grid. And so in ERCOT, we have kind of not a changing market design yet, although that's on the table, but a changing grid in that the players are changing, the suppliers are changing, the people demanding energy are changing, people or companies, and batteries are one of those new players too. And so we're going to talk about how that fits in, talk about what we call locational marginal prices, maybe even locational marginal emissions, and then we can talk about the future, and I can try to be pretty candid about policy-wise what I want for batteries. And so I had to start with a joke. I thought location, location, location was a very catchy title. Carrie King, who couldn't be with us here today, added a fourth location, wanted me to talk about space-time. And so we are not going to talk about that. But I think if anybody has Carrie, is in one of Carrie's classes, I think that would be a good topic for a paper. I made a last-minute addition to my slides today. This is from this morning. I don't know how many of you just spend your spare time on the ERCOT website, but it'll show you the prices, and the different colors are different prices. So I just wanted to demonstrate that we're talking about location, 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 and not space-time or time-space, because the location really does matter in ERCOT. So this was, looks like around 10 this morning, and then I think this is half an hour later. Well, no, this is last night. Wait. Yep, it's just somebody had it in military time and somebody didn't. This is half an hour later, and so it shows kind of the change in how things change so quickly. I like this map because it ties batteries into it. That west is where we have most of our batteries right now, so they can kind of alleviate some of that. The red is higher prices. We will get more into that, but I definitely wanted to show those two maps from this morning. So David gave me an intro. Why is it me speaking? I'm not an academic. I'm friends with Carrie, and I think that's a big part of it. My background, as he said, is I've been working in policy and market design in Texas in the ERCOT market for the last 10 years. I worked for what is called the Market Monitor, Independent Market Monitor. So I got a really good background in wholesale market design, a great mentor out of that. Her name is Beth Garza. I hope she's watching. And then my story would be telling things before and after Winter Storm Uri. 14 months ago, I was working for an advisory firm, and we specialized in analyzing how changes to energy policy affected companies' financial positions. And so we were doing that before the storm hit. So obviously that world really changed. And the other thing I talk about a lot is, the joke I make is, it used to take me about 10 minutes to explain my job to non-industry people. And now, hopefully not, but you might be really sick of hearing about ERCOT. And so that's really changed. But I was able to use that expertise to talk to people like you, talk to the public, and everybody at UT has been a big part of that. Carrie King and the Energy Institute has been a big part of that, and then Josh Rhodes and Michael Weber at the Weber Group have been really helpful too. And I hired somebody, a young person, 10 years younger than me, this summer after the storm, and when he told his friends he was coming to work for me, he said, "Caitlin Smith, if you know her from Energy Twitter." So the 10 years of work on market policy were trumped by Twitter. I am now at Jupiter Power. We are a utility scale, so as I said, grid scale battery developer and operator. Right now it's all standalone storage. I cover ERCOT, I cover communications, I cover other markets, and the first time I gave a presentation in the New England market, somebody sent me an email and asked if I was the same Caitlin Smith who is Twitter friends with UT's own Josh Rhodes. So that's me, and that's why I'm here. Jupiter Power, this is a little bit more about us. We are a startup. I have somebody that works with me here, and we're private equity backed. We have 6 projects either in operation or in construction. This says over 400 megawatts. With batteries, you also talk about megawatt hours. You talk about how long the duration is. So our total of that in construction or operation in ERCOT is 600 megawatt hours. Context on that 400 megawatts, before Winter Storm Uri, maybe 200 megawatts total of storage in ERCOT, and now 1,200 megawatts total. So that's a big chunk of it, 400. I know another couple of companies have projects coming online too. So it's really something, right, 5 times in size in a year. And so I think we'll continue to see that growth. So this is what I'm going to cover today. Can I take a quick audience poll, and who is really sick about hearing about ERCOT and Winter Storm Uri and any of that? Or people are still finding it fascinating? My lobbyist and my boyfriend said they're sick of it, so we're going to ignore them. But so I will try to go through the ERCOT market. I'm going to do two things: put things in the context of Uri, because I think that's a narrative that everybody understands, and then put things in the context of how batteries fit in. So here's ERCOT. I know you've probably heard a lot about it being its own interconnection. The quick note, and I've seen people joke about this too, it's both its own ISO and RTO. The difference between that is an independent system operator. I think of that as more of the kind of market operations, or a regional transmission operator. And so that's what it sounds like, kind of the transmission planning. And ERCOT does both. Here's some more background. So they don't own anything. They just kind of schedule everything. They have to manage all that transmission and all the generation resources. And so the generation is the supply, and the transmission is how it gets to you. So market fundamentals. This is just really like your 10th grade economics class. What it means is we use a market to get energy to you. And sometimes we use the matters, but it's really a market. So where demand and supply meet is where you get your price. The demand in this case is us, or businesses. The supply is generation, no matter what technology it is: coal, wind, solar. Two ways that we use that price to get the supply we need. One is we want it to incent not only real-time actions, but continued investment in building generation. And the other is to use the price to get generation on in real time. What I want to say about batteries here is that, like any other generator, you need prices to incent that build to continue. What I alluded to with batteries is there's a kind of duration nuance, right? When I say batteries to people, I think they think about storing energy. They ask me, like, how long can you store how much energy? I really think about it as generation. So if I have a 100 megawatt battery, I think about it not as I'm storing 100 megawatts, but I am pushing those 100 megawatts out to the grid when you need it. So maybe the storage piece is implied. But the duration, what we call duration, is how long you can push that 100 megawatts out. So if you have a 2-hour battery that's 100 megawatts, you can continually generate that 100 megawatts, like a 100 megawatt combined cycle or natural gas plant would, but only for the 2 hours. So right now in ERCOT, we're seeing mostly 1-hour batteries. Some companies like mine are investing in 2-hour batteries, but when you think about the prices needed to continue investment, you also want that duration to increase. And so you need to be conscious of things like, if there's not incentives for the 1 or 2 hour batteries to be in the market, you're not going to drive those out and then see a bunch of 8-hour batteries show up. So that's kind of an extra wrinkle to think about with batteries in the energy-only market. I forgot to mention, I was assisted in making these slides by a graduate who was at the Energy Institute a few years ago, Jenny Sauer-Brown. And she made a few of these slides for me, and she is super smart. She's with us, and she needs interns. So you guys can contact me if anybody's looking for an internship. So this is more detail about the other things you need to match in the energy-only market. It's not just the number of megawatts. You need to maintain a system frequency, and sudden changes. If a thermal plant goes down, if the sun sets, you can kind of disrupt system frequency there. So something that can ramp up or down quickly, like a battery, it's seconds, whereas maybe a gas plant could be between 10 minutes or 2 hours. It's a lot faster to respond. And then the way ERCOT provides kind of that frequency balance is these things we call ancillary services. And so generators qualify for those especially. And that's really where batteries are providing the most right now. And so here is a slide where we're using a fancy word, SCED, Security Constrained Economic Dispatch. And all it really means is that economics again. It's just how ERCOT matches generation to load in real time. During Winter Storm Uri, if you remember, at the beginning of it, we did not have prices at our market cap. And there was an order that was very controversial that you might have heard about in the news to set markets at that price, or you might have heard about it in your class. But before, the concern with not having prices at the market cap was it wasn't telling generation to come online when we needed it. And I think the news picked it up and they kept saying like the program was off, which sounds like a cult to me, or like the computer algorithm was off. And so what they were talking about was this SCED. And so the main point is what I have in green there. It's this resource offer is that intersects with system demand. It's the marginal unit. And so that marginal unit is what sets the clearing price. So there's one market clearing price there. And so what I talked about up front, I wanted to start talking about how we are seeing the supply and demand side change, the changing players. So leaving alone maybe changing the structure to our market. If we stick with an energy-only market, it's going to change because you have supply and demand, and both of those sides are changing. So on the supply side, we have a lot more wind and solar, and what this is showing is that as we have more of those resources on the grid, that marginal unit is kind of shifting over. You're wanting to pay less for the marginal unit, and that shifts over what is the marginal unit. All right, so here I have a few more slides to show how we are changing that supply side, and it's really just showing the increase in renewables. And here you have wind and solar. Here you have more about the declining costs, and even with tariffs rolling off, or the tax incentives rolling off, you still have declining costs. I think what we wanted to show here as well is in solar particularly, the more we have solar, you can also see costs declining there as well. Wind, it's not coincident with when we have load. It's blowing at 2 in the morning, and that's not when you want energy. So it makes sense that it's priced lower because there's a ton of supply and not a lot of demand. Solar is more coincident, right? I used to kind of make fun of my friend who represents the solar power company. When we do the wrap up at the end of summer, he's like, solar did great this summer because it's on peak when you need it, you know. And so I think what we're seeing is even when there's high demand, we have enough of that supply that price is declining already. This is what we call the queue. It's basically what's in line to be built. The other thing I would note that as well as the only things being in line to be built being wind, solar, and storage is that we are seeing coal plants retire. And so some of that existing is going away. The other things I would note, just because it's in the queue doesn't mean it's going to get built. There's been a lot more scrutiny, I think, around that. There's been a lot of delays since COVID, and you might hear it kind of skewed as more delays in renewable projects. But the thing I would note is those projects take a lot less time to develop than a traditional gas plant. And so if the delay is one season before it's supposed to be in operations, that's less, right? You haven't spent the 5 years that you would have spent with a thermal plant leading up to that. So it's more likely to have a delay closer to that commercial operations. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So if we look at the storage queue over there, now we're seeing some pretty substantial growth, 2018 to 2019 to 2020, all the way up to 2022. And then for next year, it's not that much larger. It's proportionally.
2023?
Yeah.
So.
Is there a reason for that?
Yep, okay. I'll repeat the question just in case. The question was, we see on the storage side, we see a lot of growth from 18 to 19 to 20 to 21 to 22, and then not for 2023. I don't know this for sure because they don't have to and won't disclose to you. My inclination is that it's probably more longer duration storage that's in the queue for then. So it would be the same amount of megawatts that's connecting. So for purposes of ERCOT's planning, it's still 100 megawatts, but I would guess that for that year, it's 100 megawatts at 2-hour duration or at 4-hour duration instead of 1 or 2 hour. That's my guess, but those companies probably wouldn't tell us. You'll see a big growth in the capacity that it can provide, because it's literally twice as much, right? If it's a 100 megawatt plant for planning purposes, right, to physically connect it to the grid, it's the same no matter what the duration is. But for purposes of exporting power, it's twice as much. So if you're 100 megawatts, you interconnect as a 100 megawatt generator no matter what your duration is. But if you are a 1-hour duration, then you can provide 100 megawatts for 1 hour. If you're a 2-hour duration, you provide that 100 megawatts for 2 hours. So it's twice as much generation capacity. And so the number that would be here would just be the physical number. It wouldn't be the megawatt hour.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the energy value is probably much larger. So the energy value, which is the megawatt hour, is probably much larger than the installed
Yeah, so
capacity.
yeah, he was confirming is the energy value much bigger. I would guess that, yeah, that's my guess.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to take more questions, as I said. I don't know if hands raised is the right way. Was that one, or stretching? Okay, sorry for drawing attention to you. More about the changing supply side. I just wanted to have fun. So this kind of highlights the renewable growth. We've been talking about it. And this ties into what I was just saying. You know, I like to say, you know, whether you love or hate renewables, they're different, so you have to plan differently for them. What we're planning for here is the amount of megawatts. When ERCOT sees this, what they need to plan for is connecting it to the transmission grid. So it's the amount of megawatts. And you plan for that with any resource, right? With wind or solar. Wind or solar are different, obviously. They are variable, I would say. They're not, right? You can't just flip a switch. It's depending on the day. But the other thing is they are located far away from load. Like there's not a bunch of wind farms right here. So the transmission planning, I think, needs to be different than it would be for a grid that was built for resources that can be built right by us. All right, here's a fun one I think you guys like. The demand side is also changing. So the supply side is the generators, the demand side is who is using the generation. Talking about Bitcoin a lot. I couldn't really tell you what it is. I got a decent explanation. I think it's just verifying things by running an algorithm over and over. The point is it's using a ton of energy constantly, but they can also use energy whenever they want. So that wind power we were talking about at 2 in the morning, you know, you can get as many, you know, as much Bitcoins at 2 in the morning as at 2 p.m., right? It's not like air conditioning. But it just kind of indicates this change, especially in ERCOT, in our market. This is the changing demand side. They are doing a lot of interesting new things. A lot of Bitcoin wants to be behind the meter, so directly connected to a wind farm or a solar farm. They're also really fast responding loads, so they can be essentially a load that's a generator, so they should have the same signals, right? Like if they can respond as fast, then we want them to kind of provide that capacity back by ramping down when we need them not to be on the grid, and they can do that. And it's the reverse of what we were talking about in interconnecting those storage megawatts, right? Traditionally, we don't have a standard process to interconnect load because you and me, we're not a ton of megawatts. It's usually like more spread out. You might have a big industrial that's 100 megawatts, but we are used to those. But with these Bitcoin mines, they come online really fast, they get built really fast, and they show up and they say, we want to consume, you know, a gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts of power, and that's hard on our system, especially with a transmission system that we usually socialize cost. So they come in, they pay their cost to upgrade, that's a big cost to them, and then we kind of need to think about the fees there. The point being just kind of the rules of our deregulated market, we got to make sure they are still intact. And we talk about an energy-only market, and that's kind of, as I said, 10th grade economics. We talk about a deregulated market. That just means we have generation owned by certain companies. So me, a solar company, a gas company, that's a certain set of companies. And then there's retailers who get the power to you. That's a different set of companies. I can't do that. I can't sell directly to you. And then there's a separate set of companies that owns the infrastructure. I can't do that either. And so when you're having these kind of new technology and new relationships, those are just things you need to start thinking about. This is more about all the Bitcoin that's coming here. I'll also thank my CEO. I got some of the slides from him as well, Andy Bowman. And so we're hearing that there's 20 gigawatts in development. Our peak system is 4 times that. And so it's a lot that they want to put on our grid. And I think, you know, same with renewables, we'll probably be a leader here in Texas. So we'll have the most of a new kind of supply and as well the most of a new kind of demand. Just to add something else, I thought this was really interesting. We've been talking about electrification of the oil and gas industry for a long time. This is an update that came from ConocoPhillips. And so this is more energy that's kind of moving to electricity use instead of direct oil and gas use. So I just kind of listed the new types of supply and demand. What's the problem with that? It's getting them to match. This is ERCOT projection, but it looks a lot like the California duck curve. And so what we are seeing in that duck curve is we are less concerned about when load is the highest, which in ERCOT is usually in the summer. So it's, you know, late afternoon in the summer when your AC is blasting. And now we're more concerned about the net load, which takes into account wind and solar. So as I said, solar's on peak. They get to show up and say, we did great during the summer. They're, you know, sun's shining. They're helping you out with that AC at 5 p.m. But when the sun sets and it's still hot out, and maybe you're home from school or work and you want to run your dishwasher and your washing machine, that's that kind of, you know, part of the duck head, I guess, that we are starting to get concerned about. So I am, of course, going to say, and it was in the abstract, right, I think batteries are a solution to this. They're primed to be like a good player right now. What we see in that market is opportunities for time shifting, so moving some of that solar energy when we need it a little bit less in the midday to the evening, storing some of that wind from 3 p.m. So you can shift that by storing it and then having the battery pump that out as generation later. Here is the battery additions by year again. I think that's consistent with what it was before. And in the queue as well. I already touched on that. I use this slide to say it because this is a picture of a battery facility in West Texas. The problem is the geographical distance of wind and solar from load, and so a good place for a battery right now is at West Texas, where the wind and solar is. So we are going to get a little bit more in the weeds on the market. So we talked about prices just being kind of supply and demand. We actually put more into it. Of course, it's always more complicated. And this is where we start talking about how transmission affects it. And so the other thing ERCOT has to do, remember it's RTO and ISO, is manage that transmission flow. And generators, that last point is the best one. Generators and load not in the same place must be connected via transmission lines. And so they might have physical constraints, kind of like a highway. It's just like traffic, right? There might be a bottleneck in certain places, and that's what we're talking about. Here is more of that. This is more on the LMPs. So if we did not have transmission constraints, we would clear a single price across the whole system, but we take those constraints into account, and so we have a locational marginal price, not just a marginal price. And that takes us to what we were looking at the very beginning. You know, sometimes I see people talking about the maps and why they're different colors, and I kind of think, you know, that's the point of having a nodal market. We used to have just 4 different prices for different load zones, but now for zonal market, now we have a nodal market, so you can really show where that price is. So you can get the local price signal as well as the system-wide. And so what we see on the left is, looks like probably some transmission constraints. On West Texas, there's all that wind. It looks like there's transmission constraints to get it to where all the people are in Houston and Dallas. On the right, kind of the opposite, looks like we have a lot of wind in the valley, and we're having trouble getting it to the rest of Texas. Maybe this is a hot day, or probably a day with a lot of, a cold day. That's February. So it's a cold day, and we can't get the wind out of the valley. In the valley, the constraint kind of goes both ways. So sometimes you'll see it red down there and the rest blue, and sometimes you'll see it the way we have it here. This is kind of a quiet day, I guess a normal day, and we still had some kind of congestion in Houston. So having something that would relieve congestion, like we were talking about the batteries in West Texas, maybe if you had a battery in Houston, it relieves the congestion there, because otherwise you have to build transmission lines, which takes a lot of planning, takes a lot of time, or maybe you can't get the air permit for a natural gas plant in the city. Do we have any questions now? Oh, look, there is one. Nope, you can do that. You can, and I think you can do it pretty quickly. The question was, if you have a 100 megawatt battery for 2 hours, can you change it to a 50 megawatt battery for 2 hours? Yeah, or 4 hours, exactly. Yes, you can. And you can decide that pretty quickly. I think in theory you can go up, but I'm not going to call on somebody in the audience to answer. You can have an inverter, right? You could have an inverter, and yeah, in theory you could make it a 30-minute battery with more, yeah. But I mean, usually what we value is the longer duration, and so yeah, you could have a 100 megawatt battery, an hour-long 100 megawatt battery, and have an inverter, and change it to a 30-minute 200 megawatt battery. But that's, what would you need that for? Like a very sudden frequency dip that only lasts 30 minutes? Does that make sense? So you're needing it for a different purpose in that case. That would be for, and I know you are, we were talking about this too. You are kind of an expert on that. And so yeah, that's not capacity. That's, you're needing it for a frequency event. In theory, you could do that. Going. All right. Okay, so more about LMPs. Wait, we did that already, I think. Oh, I copied this slide again. So this is, we were talking about the locational marginal price. So each of these dots, basically, you have a different price. By location, you have a different marginal price. The related concept I wanted to touch on is locational marginal emissions. And it measures the ton of carbon emissions displaced by 1 megawatt of energy injected into the grid at a specific location. So you can start getting data from, not from ERCOT, but about ERCOT on the locational marginal emission. So for each of those dots, you could also get the price of the marginal emissions. And so I just think that's really interesting. You know, in theory, in the energy transition, the more batteries you have on the grid, that enables you to use more wind and solar power because you can shift that to when they are needed. And so here's just, they looked at 2 solar projects and the change in LMUs there. And then on the right, it kind of shows the different levels of locational marginal emissions. And I think it's what you would expect. I think they are higher, closer to cities. And so I think you still have to kind of determine the relationship between the locational marginal emission and the locational marginal price. It might be kind of inverted or an opposite relationship right now because where you have wind that's low priced, you probably have the best emissions, meaning the lowest emissions. So I think what you want is that to be more like the higher prices can also get you low emissions. And I think storage can help do that.
Are these locational marginal emissions, is that somehow priced into the LMPs?
Nope.
Or
No,
it's just a metric?
It's just kind of right now I think it's like an academic exercise or as you're thinking about carbon neutral, carbon free, renewable goal. You know, when we talk about like 24/7 clean energy, you know, Google and people doing that, I think that's something you would think about, but it's not priced. It would be, you know, in a carbon price effectively. Well, just so it depends, right? Because sometimes you're charging, so yeah. Yeah, it's different when you're sometimes you're discharging and sometimes you're charging, so that affects what the LME is. All right, more, were we good on the LME talk? More applications for battery storage in ERCOT. So time shifting, we've talked a lot about that, kind of the main problem being, you know, when the wind and solar energy is generating to the grid might not be when we need it. And so what we mean by time shifting is just using a battery to store it and then export it when we need it. For capacity, that's more like the 100 megawatts, that's 4 hours. You can provide capacity for a long time. Ancillary services, maybe if you have a frequency response, that's more like taking the inverter and doing a short amount of time with the more megawatts. Grid services, you can do voltage support, ramping, load following. You know, a lot of things that we've been talking about recently and sort of the political discourse are what problems would come about when we have more wind and solar. Again, you know, I always say if you like them or don't like them, they're different, right? So there's some planning. I think we are concerned about that kind of duck curve-like thing that I showed you. So you would call that the solar ramp. So, you know, sunset, I don't know how long it takes, but I think a 2-hour battery would be well equipped for that solar ramp. And so we talk a lot about that application right now. And then the managing load and congestion, and that's what we were getting to at the kind of the maps, right? Your alternatives here are, why it's different colors is there's more of one in one area than the other. So where it's blue, more supply than demand. Where it's red, more demand than supply. And so if you had more transmission, that would be one way to solve it. But the other way to solve it would be to sit a battery out there, right? So when it's not as dark blue, when they are demanding some energy out in the west, you can export it then and then save it at the other times.
So if you could stay back on that other chart.
Which one?
Oh, the one on applications.
Yep.
So in ERCOT market rules, how much can you value stack? Or is it really you have to pick arbitrage with time shifting, or are they enabling battery economics to be improved by value stacking?
We're kind of just making up these terms. So you bid into the day ahead or real-time energy market, and then the day ahead ancillary services market like anybody else. Does that answer your question at all?
No.
So you can value stack.
But I mean, can you do time shifting as well as some ancillary services?
Well, you could bid into ancillary services, which would be, we just call them ancillary services, but the ramping and load following technically would fall under ancillary services as well. So you bid into ancillary services in the day ahead market, and then the capacity is in the day ahead, which is just a financial obligation or real time. So you can kind of manage and optimize that risk yourself, like another generator would as well, right? A natural gas plant could bid into ancillary services, and then in the day ahead, if they weren't dispatched.
Value stack as much as you want, as long as when ERCOT calls you answer to whoever.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, short answer, you value stack whenever you want, but you're taking on that risk, right? If you bid on an ancillary service and you do something else, you're not available then, that's a risk. But that's not specific to batteries, that's any generation.
But cost-wise for batteries, do you see it as, like you were saying for batteries, you were looking more at 4-hour windows or 4 megawatt hours now instead of a more like a peaker unit. So is battery storage more about shifting now instead of more about getting that peak demand in to get the value, call it return on investment value?
That's a good question. I think it's probably yes. I would say, we started with the value really being focused on ancillary services, on responsive reserve service. And I think, right, the other problem is with a market, once you get enough suppliers, you crowded out that market. So you have to be able to do other things. It's a different ancillary service that we're talking about using for ramping. It's going to be called ERCOT Contingency Reserve Service. That's going to be 2 hours. So it's different. But then, yeah, you could talk about capacity, and you could talk about congestion, which you'd be doing probably in the real time, right? You'd look at a map like this, and if you were in Houston at the red time, that's when you'd be selling energy. But that's harder to do if you're 1 hour and have already sold into RRS, or you get 1 hour of those prices, right? And then you have to charge, so then you have to pay those prices if you want to be able to discharge again.
And so you just brought up a really interesting point about saturation of the market. So these are containerized so that if you saturate a node, you can simply pull them up and then move to another node. It's not that easy, but it's possible. Or are they kind of embedded where they are at whatever node?
I don't know. I'm not the right person for that question.
Okay.
Lithium ion, in my understanding, is it's pretty set. The batteries we have right now, my understanding, it's pretty set. Also, when we were talking about, this queue, the planning ERCOT does is where, how they have to plan their transmission system for where you are. So you would also have to tell them.
So you give them an
You'd have to do a
NSO.
different study. You'd
Right,
have to do a whole different interconnection
You
study.
do an interconnection, then you do an NSO for 90 days, tell them you're going to pull the service and
Yeah.
then move it?
I mean,
Okay.
It certainly is possible. I mean,
in theory, right? You could dig up your battery and give an NSO, tell them you're going to move the megawatts. I don't think we've seen that or are about to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? Are we good?
I'm sure there's a business case for it where someone can make one.
Can they write that in their paper for Carrie with the time space?
There's plenty of PhD topics.
Lots of PhD battery topics. That's what we've learned. All right. Were we good on the applications? There's a question over here. Do you want to yell it or do you want a mic?
We're going to do it civilized. There we go.
Be civilized.
Transmission and distribution deferral would also be one. And is there a way to monetize grid resilience aspect of storage as well? Oh, sorry. So if we consider these applications as revenue streams for a storage project, don't you think transmission and distribution deferral is also another possible revenue stream as an application?
Oh, yeah, yes. Yeah, so when we're talking about managing congestion, you could be interpreting that to be kind of as a, and I even said it, right? It's kind of doing what transmission would do in that case. And we've explored that in Texas. As I said, just the way our market is set up, it's very clear, right? One company owns generation, another type of company owns retail, which gets the electricity to you, direct interaction with you, and other companies do the what I would call wires and poles. You could think about batteries as doing what more wires and poles would do. A revenue stream for that in Texas, I think, would be difficult. We do have some applications. There was a bill passed last year, I don't know, SB 415. And so a distribution or transmission company can contract for, I think it's a small amount. It's up to like 100 megawatts on the grid to do that. We've had, there was a study on that in 2013. There's a long history, and I can give it to you offline. But we've studied that. Encore studied the value of it with Brattle. AEP did a case on it, and then we had kind of an open, do we think this is a good idea? And we're talking about it at the legislature. I would say until URI or maybe the year before, that is kind of the policy discussion we were having around storage here in Texas. Is like, can you get a rate of return on it? Is it a transmission asset? But I think right now, probably not, right? I think, but there is that bill to be able to kind of contract for storage as a service. I would say, in other places they're looking at it. I know in ISO New England, they're looking at the storage as transmission. They're about to kick that off there. And so it's definitely something people are looking at in different places. What you run into with storage in some places, all the things we talked about, telling ERCOT that you need to come online if you're a 100 megawatt generator, if you're a 100 megawatt Bitcoin load, they have to study that impact. And so if you're a 100 megawatt battery and you want to locate in a city, no matter what ISO there is, they're going to look at that and think about the impact to that city where there's already a lot of congestion. They're going to take into account sort of the worst case. You charging when everybody else needs energy, and it's a low export scenario, and so they're going to say you have to pay all these upgrades. They're going to say the opposite of what you're saying, right? That you have to pay upgrades in order to be in that load pocket. And so in that case, you have to kind of turn it on its head from being a generator or a load and think about the transmission ability. And so I think that's, long story short, yes, and it's something we have to kind of consider. That's why I wanted to have this talk. It's, Swiss Army knife, whatever, but there's so many different applications, and that was the point I was trying to make on the Bitcoin slide too. You just kind of have to see how it fits into the rules, or you have to change the paradigm completely, because it's not a load or a generator or transmission. It can do all of the things, and so it does get a little bit fuzzy.
Additionally, storage is always considered to add to grid resilience. Have you thought about any way to monetize that aspect as well?
Resilience, well, I guess it depends on what you mean by that. I think of resilience as more in a load pocket as well. That's kind of hard to articulate in ERCOT too, because in theory, right, it's the whole grid on or off, to use the URI example. The way we shed load then was kind of a set in stone already pro rata share of load. So even if you had a battery in Houston, CenterPoint in Houston is still told you have to shed this much load. And so it's kind of hard to say, that battery right there makes you more resilient, but certainly it does because it's right there and it helps with that congestion that we saw, and you can, maybe have a behind the meter setup or work with the utility to make sure that those lines are ones that get restored first. Does that help?
I mean, yes, but my question was more directed, like, is there
Is it a revenue
policy
stream?
framework coming, or is there any thought
I think that
process
would fit into the same kind of thing, like a revenue stream for transmission, which I don't see. We are talking about a revenue stream for voltage support. So it could, I would think of that as resiliency. Or we are talking about a revenue stream for that. It's in one of the market design roadmaps. I don't think the discussion has been started.
I got a follow-up to what he was talking about.
Okay.
I thought in ERCOT, generation and transmission, like even if you're one company, you have to put blinders on and.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, they're totally separate companies.
Okay. So with the battery being able to kind
So
of
it's
go into
classified
both.
as generation right now.
Okay.
Even if you're saying it takes a place, or it does what transmission would do by kind of relieving that congestion, you're only using it as a generator. And the practical effect of that is the transmission companies, the transmission assets, get a rate of return, which is kind of what we were talking about, on whatever they're doing as a service. A generator, you have to rely on those market signals to be sure that your investment's worth it and to keep investing. And you'd also be under, right, you're not under an obligation to perform like that, right? If you were at a regulated utility, that's kind of, you're using that as a transmission asset. If you just respond like a generator, it's like willing buyer, willing seller, right? You can see the market and participate to the point earlier as you want. You can kind of value stack and manage your own risk, optimize your own risk, even if that's kind of if ERCOT doesn't think that's the optimal risk, usually or the optimization, you still get to optimize it the way you want. Does that make sense?
Oh, just one more
You have a
follow-on. Yeah. Oh,
This is just like, staff discussion now.
wouldn't that make sense for vertically integrated utilities like Austin Energy and CPS in San Antonio, where they own all sorts of assets?
Yes, it would make sense.
Thank you.
We're at 126. Keep going. I only have one more slide. And I was kind of on where we're going policy-wise.
And I have one big question about batteries. Would you like me to ask it now?
Yes.
Okay. So batteries, when we put them
About
in.
batteries in the fourth dimension.
Batteries, when we put them in, we put them in with a specific expected life, which I'm guessing based on number of charges and discharges can vary up to, they can last up to 20, 25 years maybe. Currently, I'm not aware of a way of recycling lithium ion. Is that priced in? Because we're talking about ESG, which sustainability is a piece of it. But we're putting in a lot of batteries with...
Is it priced into the ERCOT market? No, it's same as the emission stuff. It's not currently priced in.
Okay. So when we're looking at sustainability, is that something that's being considered?
Yeah, I think it is being considered. Uh-oh, I ruined this whole thing.
Do you happen to know how it's being considered?
No.
Thank you.
Uh-oh. Yeah. This is going. I have a policy slide somewhere, but I've at some point messed up the kind of slideshow. So I don't know how we're doing this. I can talk through it, or we can take questions. I know we got the one big question. All right, so we are still talking a lot about market design in PUC or ERCOT. I think what I talked about today was the not changing design, kind of the changing supply and demand side, but we're talking about changing the design as well. So it's not specific to batteries, it would affect everybody, but I just didn't know if that would be kind of interesting to the audience here. We talked about the prices. Some of the things we've done since the winter storm are we have lowered the price cap from $9,000 to $5,000. We have changed the adder. We did talk about locational marginal prices, and we talked about how those are made up of price and some congestion. But on top of that, before the wholesale price gets to us, there's a couple of adders to further incentivize as a generator needing incentives to stay in the market. There's some of that. We are adding a couple of services to ERCOT. We are going to add a firm fuel service. We're going to add a backstop reserve service. I think at this time, neither of those are things batteries are going to participate into because of the short duration. I think those would be more like days worth of duration. But we are implementing some new ancillary services. We talked about the solar ramping product, so that's something that's coming that's good for batteries. And then we are talking about maybe like bigger scale market design changes. I would say the things I just listed are changes you make on the existing premise of we're in an energy-only market, but we're talking about that premise maybe changing. A load side obligation, which would be kind of, you'd have a capacity requirement and each load would meet that. So they'd be paying generation to be there, right? That could be a revenue stream, but that would get rid of that volatility we saw in prices. Maybe credits for incentivizing certain type of generation. We're also talking about cost allocation. If you see the kind of renewables as causing some sort of problem or causing issues on the grid, we're talking about allocation of products that would alleviate that to them. And then we are talking a little bit about queue reform. So as we saw, there are a ton of things in line to be built. And so should we prioritize some of those or not? And I just wanted to kind of touch on all those discussions. And happy to take more questions.
Hi, thank you for the nice presentation. Going with the title of the talk, location, 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 you said, and then I see that at least Jupiter batteries are in the West Texas region, right? So how did you decide to put it in there? If it is it the right place? How do you know?
Yeah, in ERCOT, it's not just Jupiter's, I think all of the batteries right now are in the West Texas region. We did talk a little bit about the issues with locating maybe in a load center and not being able to get a transmission rate of return. Across the country too, I would say most batteries from all companies are kind of where in rural areas where wind is. And so that's the reason for the location, is that's kind of near generation that needs to get somewhere else or needs to be time shifted.
Okay. And for the the new, I guess, future batteries, additional 4,000 megawatts or whatnot, do they have locations in mind already, or?
Yeah, we do have locations in mind already. I don't think I'm at liberty to discuss where our locations would be, but I think, they vary based on the applications that we discussed, right? If you are kind of just trying to time shift, then you're near wind. If you're trying to alleviate congestion, then you maybe would want to be in an urban center, but there's issues there. As we kind of talked about, the difficult thing, why we talked about location was with the kind of nodal prices, because the only way you get a revenue stream as a generator is not through a rate of return. Even if you are providing more of a transmission service, you can't be transmission right now. You can't be owned by a transmission company right now. And so you kind of have to capitalize on what the price is there. So somewhere with high volatility, you know, you can discharge at a high price and charge because you're also going to be a load at a low price. And so that's what you're really taking into account in ERCOT and everywhere. And a lot of times balancing that with the cost to interconnect is where there's wind is kind of in a rural area.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. My question is a little bit more general. Many of us here are students. I was wondering if there's anything that you would give, you know, as advice to us for things that we should be kind of trying to learn or experiences we should try to gain while we're in school that might prepare us for a grid that is rapidly changing, including a grid that has battery storage, which is, you know, kind of becoming more and more prevalent.
To work on the grid or just to exist in the grid?
I think just, sorry, yeah, I guess that was unclear. I think just kind of as we're, you know, trying to gain different skill sets or experiences, like, is there anything that you kind of have found to be helpful in your career or anything that Jupiter is looking for that would be helpful that we could be focusing on now?
Yeah, you know, I think I get a lot of really young people and students asking kind of like how to get into clean energy. And I like clean energy and I studied environmental law, but it's what's economic. I think it's what people are building. And I think that's going to continue to be true. You know, we talk about policy a little bit and we talked about the storm a little bit. And I would think after some of the finger pointing, you would see maybe a decline in clean energy projects, and you really haven't because, you know, a Google, an Amazon, a Facebook, a Tesla, they want clean energy. And so maybe the answer to that is you would know better than I do. Probably just do what you're doing. You know, generally to work somewhere, I think just having the attitude to learn. I think it's new for everybody. And so you could take the point of view that you could become an expert just as quickly as anybody else because it's sort of new right now, but it's going to keep changing, right? I think if you learn solar or you learn batteries, well, then you're going to have to learn hydrogen next or fuel cells, but I think that's really exciting. So I think just having kind of the willingness to keep learning. And I think you have great professors here. Jenny, who I mentioned, I think wrote a thesis a couple years ago on 24/7 carbon-free energy, and you know, it's something that companies continue to work on now.
Thank you so much.
Of course.